Good afternoon and welcome to this installment of the Exploring Sustainable Seafood virtual panel series. My name is Kim Thompson and I'm the director of the Aquarium in the Pacific's Seafood for the Future program. In the first two panels, we discussed how seafood, including responsible marine aquaculture, might play a role in supporting a more climate-friendly food supply. But that's not the whole story. A growing body of research shows that some types of marine aquaculture may provide benefits beyond food that can help society adapt and build resilience in the changing climate. Environmental groups and policymakers in the US and abroad are now looking at marine aquaculture as a potential tool to add to their broader portfolios of climate solutions. Today we are joined by researchers who have been looking at marine aquaculture as a potential tool to help support efforts to address climate change. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists, Dane Klinger from Conservation International, Rebecca Gentry from Florida State University, and Heidi Alleway from the University of Adelaide. You can find their bios and additional information from this and other panels at aquariumpacific.org. Now let's dive in and get to know a little bit about our panelists. Becca, we're going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, and is what you're doing now anywhere close to what you thought you were going to be doing when you first applied for college?
Yeah, hi everyone, and Kim, thank you so much for having us today. I work on a variety of different topics and questions related to marine aquaculture development, sustainable seafood, and the interactions of aquaculture with the marine environment, including with relation to climate change. When I was applying to college, I was very interested in science in the marine environment, but I also had a lot of different interests and actually ended up being an English major in college. So I've taken kind of a windy route to get where I am, and ended up going back and doing my science training in graduate school. So yeah, somewhat, but not exactly what I thought I would be doing.
Dane, how about you? What is it that you're working on now, and is what you're doing now anywhere close to what you thought you were going to be doing when you were 18 and applying for college?
Sure, and thanks again for having me on the webinar. I lead Conservation International's Global Aquaculture Program, and we work in three main areas on different types of aquaculture around the world. And that's working to improve management and governance of the aquaculture sector, working to improve access to sustainable finance for the aquaculture sector, and then support for innovators, be they companies or governments that are doing things in a way that we think can transition the aquaculture sector towards more responsible production. And I started working on environmental science in college, mostly focusing on marine science, and I gravitated towards seafood, fisheries, and aquaculture because that's really where multiple human components of marine science come together. So, when you want to solve an aquaculture problem, when you want to solve a fishery problem, it's not enough just to ask a scientific question. You have to think about the political implications, the economic implications, the sociological implications, and really factor in all those different dynamics. So even as an early undergrad, I gravitated towards these human and natural science problems. And that's really what led me to work on aquaculture and marine policy in general today.
So it sounds like you were really drawn in by the interdisciplinary nature of aquaculture and food systems.
Absolutely. These are complex, multifaceted problems.
And that seems to be a common theme here. And Heidi, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in the land of koalas and kangaroos? And is what you're doing now anywhere close to what you thought you were going to be doing when you first applied for college?
Yeah, sure. And hello from Australia. Thanks for the chance to be involved in this conversation. It's really exciting. And currently I'm working on, starting to understand and unpack the potential for aquaculture to be more than just a food system. So how can we potentially integrate food production with a whole range of other environmental outcomes and potential environmental benefits? And we're currently looking at these as ecosystem services. So in a broader context, I like to think about them as the enablers for building up, repairing, restoring and enhancing environmental function and integrity. So how can we position aquaculture to be a really well-designed and very proactive industry into the future that does directly improve climate resilience and potentially, I think, be a main motivator for reducing climate impacts in the ocean. It's been an interesting one for me coming into aquaculture. My background is actually a blend between research and public policy. And I've spent nearly 15 years working for the South Australian government. So that's a state government entity, and that was in our Department of Primary Industries. And so I worked across policy development and natural resource management. And for the last few years of my time there, I was the general manager for aquaculture. And it was that experience, I think, that really prompted me to take a greater move into understanding potential environmental benefits from aquaculture. And I like to use this example of the fact that from a public policy position, we often treat aquaculture as an adverse activity. So we come from this very potential negative outcome. The only benefit is around economic outcomes and food production. And I disagree with that in a future world. And it's about building up those systems that can recognise and respond to those potential broader benefits, whilst also acknowledging that there's a lot we need to do to continue to make aquaculture as sustainable as possible. And that's not just a single point in time, that's a continual improvement process. So it's not what I expected to be doing, I think. I think I've come into it from experience and sort of this growing interest and the growing awareness about potentially what we could deliver. My research background is actually in historical ecology, and I still continue to do some historical ecology work. And I'm also really fascinated by the historical background for aquaculture too, and how potentially we can bring that into a current setting through simplified systems and different ways of doing aquaculture into the future.
I feel like that's a new thing for all of us to look up, is historical ecology. I've never heard of that. Very interesting. I think that could be a whole other talk. So I think that was a brilliant also segue into the rest of the discussion, and I look forward to hearing more from you guys as we unpack all of this. So in previous panels, we have discussed how seafood and marine aquaculture can provide more nutritious food in the changing climate with fewer impacts. But there's a lot more to this story in terms of how marine aquaculture might contribute to that climate solution portfolio. So Heidi, we're going to start with you. Can you describe to us how marine aquaculture might help communities to better adapt and build resilience in the changing climate?
Yeah, so I think we're just starting to unpack this conversation. It's a really exciting one because we're realising there is a wide range of ways in which that could potentially happen with aquaculture. So aquaculture as a well-designed industry does have the potential to be a lower greenhouse gas emissions source of protein. The recent estimates were that aquaculture across bivalve and finfish aquaculture was about 0.5% of total anthropogenic emissions in 2017. And even while that sounds low, it is the equivalent of production of sheep. And there is always room for improvement in that as well. The other thing that figure doesn't take into account is some of the really lengthy supply chains associated with seafood. And so there is the opportunity to think about how we could design aquaculture to be a very local and highly sustainable source of protein throughout the world. So it's an exciting conversation to think about where can we site and where can we put aquaculture to support communities in accessing protein that is generally or can be a lower source of emissions. The other ones that really interest me are the potential for aquaculture to support or improve environmental health. So where can we use aquaculture as an activity to potentially restore environments or repair degraded functions? So there might be deteriorated water quality. What we do know is that intact and healthy environments can better withstand the impacts of climate change. That's an absolute given. So how potentially can we use aquaculture to reinstate some of those functions to make environments more resilient, as we talked about before, thereby supporting communities as well in that outcome. And then the third one that I always like to think about, but I think is a really, really big space, and this is going to be a huge conversation that we are very much just at the beginning of, is how can we support carbon sequestration and sequestration of emissions through healthy and intact environments as well. And there are probably many ways in which that can be done. But if we can support aquaculture to be a highly sustainable and positive, or have a positive effect on the environment, can we actually influence that design to support natural carbon habitats such as seagrass and mangroves, and target our actions towards improving their health and their benefits as well, so that we increase carbon sequestration and carbon cycling as well.
And that's a term associated blue carbon, is that correct?
Yeah, so that's what we would generally term as blue carbon. So blue carbon's often, I think, referred to with a fairly broad remit, but it does specifically target the natural carbon cycle in marine environments, and those high value, I think, carbon habitats around seagrass, salt marshes and mangroves.
So one of the things you did allude to there was siting, which I should mention a plug for Becca, because she's in another panel later where they will get in depth on siting for marine aquaculture. But for this discussion, Becca, do you have anything to add to how marine aquaculture may help communities adapt and build resilience to the changing climate?
Yeah, absolutely. Heidi talked about a lot of really important issues, but I think another thing that is important to think about is, especially in communities that may not have marine aquaculture now, or have a very limited amount of marine aquaculture and are considering developing aquaculture further, is looking at our food systems as a whole. And we know that climate change is going to cause disruptions to food systems. And so aquaculture has the potential, by developing new industries, of diversifying our food production. And that is important because the more diverse our food production is, when there are different stressors that are happening due to climate change or other issues, they may impact one type of food production more than others. And if we have multiple types of food production happening, that can help communities become more resilient. And as far as diversity, aquaculture compared to land-based production actually has a lot more species that are produced throughout the world. So there's the potential there as well to have different species growing in different ways in different places that can add resiliency to our overall food systems.
So, and this is something that people may be familiar with, termed the portfolio effect, right? Diversifying how we produce our food.
Yeah, portfolio theory talks about these ideas of when you have different things happening, like when you diversify and there's a type of shock, that the whole system might be able to weather those shocks in a more steady way.
And so it sounds like, so Becca, you were just mentioning taking a step back, looking at it from a food system approach. So that's kind of more of a global approach. But then what Heidi was talking about with kind of those ecosystem services, that would be more of a benefit for local communities and local ecosystems. Is that accurate?
Yes and no. I think that both of those things can be both local and global. When you're talking about food systems in a community, if you diversify within a community, you can add resilience to those specific communities and add food security to those communities. And I also think some of the things Heidi was talking about with the potential for carbon sequestration and stuff, these are global issues. And so I think across all of these different things we've talked about, there's local components and global components, would be my take on it.
So you've mentioned all this great potential for aquaculture as a tool at these different levels, both from a food system perspective, but then an ecosystem benefit perspective. But Heidi, what then are some of the hurdles that we need to overcome to realize this potential that you've just been talking about for marine aquaculture as a tool to help society address climate change?
Yeah, I think that's the big question, and it's not straightforward. And I'd probably say at the start that a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work. What we do know about the global food production, or food production at a global level, is that it is now highly homogenised, and that has come with some strong benefits because we can ensure that there is or support access to a range of foods, but at the same time, homogenisation has potentially overridden, or I think weakened some of those local systems. And so what we need to do is to recognise that anything we talk about at a global level or a regional level still needs to come with a local context. So we have to be better at applying a locally contextualised solution. When we do that, we therefore start to get into a conversation about, well, what do developing countries need to actually translate some of these solutions, and what might they need to engage in aquaculture if they don't at the moment, because there are a lot of countries that don't practice aquaculture. So if we consider a developing nation in that way, we're then talking about not just funding and policy and management approaches, but we're talking about infrastructure as well, and training and education, and really building capacity from the ground up. That's very different to somewhere like Australia, where what we probably need at the moment are some policies that fit into that category of transformative capacity. So how can we pull a lot of our industry activities forward and I think move into that next phase of ecologically sustainable development for aquaculture? Some of the other barriers, I think, to break that down further, there's an interesting conversation around trade-offs in meeting objectives for sustainability. And we now know that under climate change, those trade-offs are inherent. They're really hard to navigate. And so communities across the world are going to need a lot of support to identify trade-offs and understand, I think, how to navigate them, and then make decisions under what is an increasingly complex environment. So support for decision making, and again, that might be targeted tools, and it might also be just enabling that conversation and some of those policy developments to take place. What we tend to boil that down into is some categories that we can target, and those do look like policy, the policy mechanisms, but they are very different depending on where you are. And then also some transformation around aquaculture specific activities, such as where does feed come from? How can we improve the sustainability of feed, and how can we make some of those transformations there to enable aquaculture to expand sustainably? And then there is a big conversation living around technology. And again, technology is one where there's probably a range of technology applications that could be put in place, which would have really fantastic outcomes. But if they're not cost effective, and if local communities or if developing nations can't access that technology, then again, we need to be looking at different solutions.
I'd add one more barrier that I think could be, depending on the context, it could be a barrier or an opportunity. And that's really understanding and utilizing different global and local market dynamics, and using those market dynamics as a way to incentivize both increased food production and better environmental performance. And so, as an example of one project we're working on, the shrimp aquaculture sector has historically been the leading cause of mangrove deforestation globally. But if you look at how the market has functioned and sort of how production and supply and demand dynamics have functioned over the last decade or so, on average, the real price of shrimp has been going down year after year after year. And so there's this push inside the shrimp market where if a farmer wants to remain competitive, they need to get their cost of production per kilogram of shrimp down. And the best way to do that is to intensify production. But shrimp is also highly prone to disease risk. And so farmers around the world are kind of stuck in this tug of war where they want to intensify, but they're also afraid of disease. They want to intensify, but they often don't have access to capital or expertise to intensify. And so we've been working with shrimp farmers to work with them to try and get over this hurdle where they want to intensify production to remain competitive, to help them get access to the best technology and the finance to build sustainable intensification. But in exchange, since they can produce more shrimp on less land, if they started out with 100 hectares of ponds, we help them intensify on a subset of those and then restore mangroves on the remainder of the ponds. And the idea there is that you have all this extra land that historically was mangroves, that all of a sudden, because you're intensifying production on a smaller portion of the ponds, that extra land can be restored to mangroves. And not only does it confer these climate adaptation benefits, it also can act as a buffer for some of the effluent coming out of the farm. So it's kind of a win-win-win. And that's, again, just trying to understand sort of the business and market context in which a lot of aquaculture is taking place, and trying to leverage opportunities where they are available to align incentives for both increased food production and conservation.
So it sounds like the major hurdles are understanding those local and global market dynamics, and at a very high level, it's policy, it's social capacity, it's economic capacity, it's funding, but it's also understanding that we need to be able to look at this more contextually at a local level as well as at a global level. Did I capture that correctly? Trying to simplify this complicated information. Did I miss anything, Heidi?
And I was just say so pretty much everything, but I think everything in different amounts, and that's probably the number one thing that we could do with this conversation about, well, how do we tackle it? So, well, we need to have a global conversation because we can learn from each other. And there's so many applications and so much information available. I think if we just sort of connect that conversation, but we still need to be thinking about it in terms of what will work in a local market. And that shrimp example is fantastic too, because that is a local sort of solution. So it's about creating some of that connectivity between it, because different things will be needed by different people.
And I think I forgot to mention technology in there. Just want to throw that in there because that's clearly very important. So I want to switch gears now a little bit. And Becca, we're going to start with you on this one. So we've talked about the potential for marine aquaculture to help address some of these impacts of climate change. But like any other food system on the planet, marine aquaculture is also not immune to the impacts of climate change. So how does climate change impact marine aquaculture production? And do these impacts affect some species groups or types of farming more than others?
Yes, absolutely. Climate change has the potential to have really significant effects on aquaculture, like it does on almost all food production, like you said, Kim. Where there's a lot of science showing how climate change might be impacting our oceans and already is impacting our oceans. I think that's important to make that point. And marine aquaculture being grown directly in the oceans, a lot of those impacts can really directly affect production of marine aquaculture. I think there are so many to talk about. We could spend the rest of this whole thing talking about these different types of impacts, but I'll go over a few pretty quickly. I mean, simply the oceans getting warmer can really impact marine aquaculture. It impacts what species can be grown where, how well they're grown. If the temperatures aren't what is expected, the growth can be really different. Of course, there can be winners and losers. It's not always negative. Certain species might actually do better in the new conditions we're seeing, but the science so far shows that overall productivity is likely to decrease, even though there will be some disparity in how things are happening. And the warmer water also affects other things happening in the ocean. So we're more likely to see more harmful algal blooms potentially with warmer oceans, which can be really destructive to aquaculture. It can make certain types of aquaculture unsafe to eat, especially bivalves. There's a lot of issues there, but it can also cause impacts to fish aquaculture and things as well. If you have algal blooms and areas of hypoxia, it can be really challenging for different types of aquaculture. Warmer waters have also been shown to likely increase disease burdens, which can be a really big deal for marine aquaculture production. In addition, we see ocean acidification happening, and that can be really problematic, especially for species that form shells. We're already seeing some issues in hatcheries for bivalves that are impacted. In addition, we're seeing increased storms and things like that happening with climate change, and that of course can impact different types of marine aquaculture production if we're seeing large climatic events happening and instability. I'd also like to mention that for fed aquaculture, anything that's impacting feed could potentially impact production. So instability we're seeing in land-based production or in fisheries could potentially impact production there too. So I went through a bunch of stuff really quick and I haven't touched on everything. I think the point is that yes, absolutely, we're seeing changes and it's really important to think about those in thinking about the future of aquaculture, how we're planning it, how we're managing it, etc.
And Dane, do you have anything to add to that in terms of how climate change impacts aquaculture production or marine aquaculture production?
Sure. So as a postdoc a couple years ago, I did an analysis, a modeling analysis looking at finfish growth with high resolution climate change model. And we looked at a cold water species, a temperate species, and a warm water species, and looked at how aquaculture, as it's performed today in coastal waters, might be impacted with expected temperature increases. And we found that for the most part, for the three species we looked at, over the next 30 years, there wouldn't be that much of a substantial change. And that has to do with the fact that, well, all species, but fish included, have what's called a thermal performance curve for growth. There's a temperature at which the water is too cold, they stop growing. There's a temperature at which is just right and they grow the fastest. And then there's a temperature at which it's too warm and they stop growing. And in between, there's increases and losses in efficiency. But for the most part, the aquaculture industry, as it's practiced now, isn't right at that optimal line, and it isn't past that optimal line. So there's some room to grow. And then even when there is an impact, or where there might be an impact, we found that the industry has tools. They have options for adapting to expected climate change. And so for fish farmers, they can utilize things like selective breeding to select for fish that are more thermally resistant. And sort of climate change, changes in sea surface temperature are happening slow enough that selective breeding programs can respond in due time to help reduce some of those impacts. Well, one of the big unknowns was disease. So pests, pathogens, parasites, they're one of the biggest concerns in aquaculture around the world. They're the biggest loss center in an aquaculture business. Some people estimate that they cost the aquaculture sector upwards of $6 billion every year. And what we don't really have a good understanding of is how climate change will affect pathogens that we already deal with and our ability to deal with those pathogens, but also how new pathogens might emerge and how we might or might not be able to deal with those as an aquaculture sector. And so now we're trying to get a better understanding for different types of aquaculture, what that might look like and how we might be able to prepare and respond accordingly.
So, Dane, you mentioned selective breeding as one potential tool to help address some of these issues of how climate change might impact some of these farms. Can you give us some more examples of some technologies that might help farms adapt to the changing climate?
Yeah. So, thinking about an individual farmer and how they might respond beyond selective breeding, they can change the way in which they grow the fish. So the ocean is 3D. The temperature at the surface is not the same temperature, 10 meters below the surface. And so if they're farming in cages at the surface now, they can potentially use submersible cages where they can adapt, they can move the fish in the water column to respond to different temperatures. That's not necessarily a long-term solution in most cases, but it is an adaptive response. But there's also, thinking about the aquaculture sector more broadly, for species that have a clear market and we want to continue farming, but there might not be environments that are easily amenable and available to farming those species. Things like recirculating systems on land become attractive options for increasing production and without diversifying species. But other things farmers can do is just, if the current species is unsuitable, they can switch to different species. But of course, that's expensive. There's costs there. It's not only learning how to farm a different species or adapting the infrastructure to farm a different species, but if a market doesn't already exist, you have to invest large amounts of money in building the market for that species. That involves getting customers excited about it, getting customers knowledgeable about it. All of that is to say that whatever the adaptive measure is, there are, of course, costs and trade-offs associated with those. And I think one of the big uncertainties is with all of the expected climate change impacts on the aquaculture sector, really, what are the costs of dealing with them? What are the costs of not dealing with them? And going back to that business perspective or that governance perspective, what are the things that the sector really needs to think about responding to now versus further along in the future?
And And am I correct in saying that cobia is a good example of an emerging species that they're now trying to develop that market for, that they're farming in open pens offshore?
Absolutely, yeah.
And Becca, do you have anything to add in terms of technologies and science that farmers can use to help adapt to climate change?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Dane has covered some really important things for farmers to be thinking about. And I think the point that he made that there are options out here. There are a lot of challenges, but I think there are options and ways of looking at these and adapting. One thing is real-time monitoring of the oceans and of farms. There's a lot of technology to understand what's happening in the oceans right now. And if we have different monitors to track, say, harmful algal blooms and things like that, oxygen concentration in the waters, farmers have the ability to react pretty quickly when things are happening. And so I think that sort of monitoring and data information is an important tool. I'd also like just to emphasize planning, marine spatial planning, thinking about where farms should go. It's great to think about where the best places are to put farms, thinking about today's conditions, but we do have some information about what the oceans are going to be like in the future. So trying to future-proof those plans to some extent. As Dane said, it is possible to switch species and switch things like that. But if we can think about it from a slightly longer range idea as we're planning farms, I think that can be really helpful.
So it sounds like, yes, climate change can impact the farms, but there are emerging technologies. We do have some knowledge and some techniques that the farmers can use to adapt and responsibly farm in these changing conditions. Is that accurate?
I would say that that's pretty accurate. There are challenges. There are some ways that we can help mitigate and adapt. I think we're going to have to see how things go. Some of these challenges, such as ocean acidification, we'll have to see. And they're pretty big challenges, especially for bivalves. So what our oceans are going to look like into the future is a bit of a challenge. I don't know if the other panelists agree with that. I think we should be rosy in our outlook, but I think we should also be a little bit measured that we're facing some pretty big challenges.
Yeah, and can I ask a question of Dane? Are you constantly blown away by just how complex some of these systems can be? So if we start to think about the role of aquaculture in, throughout the supply chain, and where there can be potential vulnerabilities from, sourcing seed stock, and if seed stock is actually dislocated from where the aquaculture activity happens, and you talked, Becca, about where does feed come from, and if that's also exposed to the impacts of climate change as well, some of those complexities really play out in multiple ways. And does it still surprise you how complex some of those systems can be on the ground, or do you feel like we're starting to get a better handle on just how big that picture is and where we potentially need to focus?
So that's a really good question. I think aquaculture systems, their social ecological systems, their market systems, their environmental systems, they're incredibly complex. And if you're talking about forecasting what might be challenge points or bottlenecks or growth opportunities, it's difficult enough. And then when you think about the current industry and how entrenched it is, and who the players are, and who the markets are, and what's being grown, and really how you might go about changing what's currently there, and what kind of levers you'd have to pull on to realize those changes, it definitely is super complex. But I'm encouraged by the increasing recognition of aquaculture as part of the global food system. And with that comes a recognition of all these complexities, but also a realization that tools that have been developed for agricultural systems and other natural resource-based sectors, be they financial tools or scientific tools or marketing tools, they can help solve some of those problems for aquaculture.
And as we've mentioned in a couple of other panels in this series, sustainability is a journey, right? So we can leverage those tools and we can continue to chip away and improve the process. So now I want to put all of you in the hot seat and put you guys in the driver's seat. So I'm going to start with Heidi on this one. If, knowing what you know, and knowing where the gaps are, if you were going to design a marine aquaculture sector in your community to maximize its role as a tool to help society develop climate solutions, what would it look like?
So I would like to start by, I think, acknowledging and respecting the opportunity that sits with offshore aquaculture and some of the technologies that are available to really advance, I think, intensive aquaculture at a global level. But for me, one of the things that I'm really fascinated about is how can we bring aquaculture closer to shore? How can we keep it closer to shore? How can we bring it closer to urban centres so that we're shortening some of those supply chains that potentially could undermine the value of seafood producer aquaculture as a low greenhouse gas emissions source? We tend to find aquaculture still put into places, I think, that are a little bit out of sight and out of mind. And so I'd love to work out, how do we design systems to be respected by all communities and, more importantly, wanted by all communities? And the ultimate would be seeing fish farmed, close to high density cities. And I think, providing that local source of seafood. So it's just one of my interests. I think there would be a lot of impact in designing those sorts of systems. How we do that, again, there's a wide range of ways in which it could happen. And the other thing that I'd love to see alongside that is this broadening of recognising that aquaculture is a food system, but what are the non-food benefits too? So coupling the non-food production with the food production to deliver some of those ecosystem services, potentially repairing or restoring environments as well, or supporting their recovery. To me, that would be an ultimate aquaculture system.
So just to make sure that I'm picking this up correctly. So essentially you're saying keeping it as local as possible and ensuring that it's in communities that accept it and want it there. But then also recognizing that in addition to being an important part of our food supply, it is also has non-food benefits in terms of localized ecosystem benefits.
Yeah, something that does that I think that would be fantastic. And, that's I think that'd be the perfect system.
And Becca, how about you? If you were designing your perfect marine aquaculture sector to help address climate change, what does that look like?
So my perfect climate change sector would probably look a little bit different from what Heidi said, but I think she brings up a lot of really good points. I would probably design primarily offshore. I think our nearshore systems have a lot of impacts happening, are very vulnerable. Some of those systems, such as mangroves, are really important for climate change otherwise. And I would probably try to move as much of the industry offshore as we could, focused on seaweeds, bivalves primarily, I think would be the most climate friendly way of going. Not that fish doesn't have a place there, but if we're talking about like the prime systems for climate change, I would focus more on kelps and bivalves, and to have that industry be actively engaged with science and research around carbon sequestration, ocean acidification, different low carbon feeds, just having a very dynamic science-based industry that's also very nimble and can react really quickly to what's happening in the ocean environment.
So you've summed that up pretty nicely. So you're saying mainly shellfish and bivalves and moving it offshore and in keeping with the scientific community and having that relationship between the scientific community and the farming community.
Yeah, just continuing research on these different aspects so we can really understand them.
Great. And Dane, how about you? You get to design your ideal aquaculture sector to help address climate change. What does it look like?
Well, I'd start with the recognition that there's no free lunch. All food production has some environmental cost and some sort of climate implication. And also the aquaculture sector is incredibly diverse. 400 plus some odd species were farmed as of 2018, and in multiple different production systems. So I wouldn't constrain myself to thinking about marine aquaculture, because moving offshore is important, and making sure we get coastal aquaculture right is important. But thinking about climate change and how that might impact humans around the world, and food security, and all those other implications, I think there's a lot we can do in the near term, helping improve freshwater aquaculture, which is the majority of aquaculture and feeds most of the world from an aquaculture perspective now. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there that I think is critical to address, while we also invest resources into these more longer term development options like offshore aquaculture and recirculating systems. But in terms of which I would pick, I think I agree with Heidi in that it's incredibly important to think about local dynamics when siting and developing a farm. So everything from what the community will accept and what the community wants, but also what are the comparative advantages of that area? Are there extra resources, be they ecosystem services or hydroelectric electricity, or low sea surface or low wave height that might make one system better than another? And then choosing what you're going to grow and in what system based on those local attributes. But again, also thinking about the global market and sort of this broader global food system in which you're existing.
So your idea of an ideal marine or ideal aquaculture sector to help address climate change would also integrate freshwater and looking at those systems and helping to improve those systems, and then also understanding local ecosystem and social capacities, but then also balancing that with the global needs. Did I get that correct?
That very easy task.
Simple. We can do it tomorrow. Which actually brings me to the next question. And Dane, we're gonna stick with you on this one. Do we have the capacity now to develop a responsible marine aquaculture sector in countries like the US and Australia that does provide some support to help society build resilience and adapt to climate change now?
Long answer. In terms of offshore aquaculture, offshore finfish aquaculture, and other types of offshore aquaculture as well, I think there's still an open-ended question about the environmental impact at scale. There's been a lot of small-scale operations. There have been many models, but we still don't know what happens when you put a massive industrial-scale fish farm out in pelagic or ligotrophic or a nutrient, low nutrient zone. And I think we still need to figure out what that looks like from a regulatory perspective and from an industrial perspective, because there's this tug of war where, as a farmer, you want to put the cages as close as you can to each other because that reduces your transportation costs. But the further you spread them apart, the lower the potential environmental impact. And so it's things like that we need to understand better. And we can't really do it until there is an industrial scale industry. As it emerges, we need to better understand those trade-offs and how to regulate the sector. And the US and Australia and other countries that are willing to invest the substantial resources and taxpayer dollars into doing that will certainly be good places to test it versus other areas where there might not be the capacity or the willingness to invest those resources.
So Becca, do we have the capacity to develop a responsible marine aquaculture sector in countries like the US and Australia that provides some support to help society adapt to climate change? And do we have that capacity now?
So I think in a lot of ways, the answer is yes. I think Dane really touched on some of those issues, but I think capacity has multiple different dimensions. And we also need to be talking about like the social carrying capacity and things like that. Do our communities want aquaculture? Do they want marine aquaculture happening? Is there political will to make it happen? There's a question, do we have the scientific capacity? Do we have the industrial capacity and the economic capacity? I think a lot of that stuff is is possible, but I'm not I think it's still to be seen whether we really have the will to have it happen.
From what you know scientifically, from what you know on the research, do we have enough information to move forward responsibly with aquaculture to start supporting climate change solutions?
Absolutely. We have enough to start moving forward. I think, as Dane pointed out really well, we need more research. We need to keep a lot of these, like, moving offshore and building up bigger industry. We certainly have a lot of information. We have a lot of science. We have a lot of data to make this happen in a really responsible way, but we need to keep circling back. We need to monitor. We need to see how it's actually working in real life, and then we can make it better and better.
And Heidi, how about you? Do we have the capacity to expand responsible marine aquaculture in countries like the US and Australia to help society adapt and build resilience in a changing climate?
Yeah, I think we have the capacity. And I echo the same thoughts as Becca there, that I think it comes back to will to do so. One of the things that I think we need to do soon is to broaden that information base, because we do have the right information. We have a lot, but we need to keep building that up. We need to start looking at other industries and start building a more connected narrative about how to really scale up aquaculture. And the example there, building on some of Dane's points as well, is intensification of offshore finfish farming is needed, and it's a good way to go. But there's a classic example that if you're shipping these products around the world and you're using fossil fuels, you're actually undermining a lot of those benefits as well. So what we need to do is bring in conversations about biofuel production as well. And we know that we can produce biofuels from seaweed. So how do we actually put in place those systems and those structures around directly integrated biofuel use into production of finfish too? And that's just one example. There's a whole range of really valuable questions to sort of unpack, and I think actions that we could be investing in now. But it does come back to, I agree with Becca, it comes back to the will. And we need to be honest about, do countries such as Australia and the USA show not just the will for aquaculture, but the will in using some of these systems to address the climate change challenge? And some of those countries might invest in aquaculture development, but if they're not also investing in some of the drivers for climate change, then we do need to think about what that broader conversation is. And we do need to pinpoint how that's going to play out, because aquaculture might then develop over the next 10 years in a really valuable way, but it's not a connected conversation about addressing climate change.
So you mentioned will, including political will. And so that is a good segue into the next question. And Heidi, we're going to start with you on this one. So if I were to go to policymakers who are considering marine aquaculture as a potential tool for climate solutions, what's the one most important point that you think that I would need to get across?
That we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's no two ways about it. It has to happen. And I think as soon as we acknowledge that actively across all industries, whether they are considered to be large emitters or comparably lower emitters, we can then have a really fantastic conversation about, well, what does that look like? And the beautiful thing about aquaculture is we do have an opportunity to design systems that can be low emission sources of protein, but also beneficial for communities, and coming back to building up community resilience, that active part about enabling communities to respond and adapt to climate effects. But then to also look at some of these really unique technologies that might actually be leaders in food systems as a whole. But that's a process of continual improvement. And I think if we come from that basis, that single basis of we need to address the drivers of climate change and we need to address emissions, then we can have a good look at what aquaculture could actually do.
And Dane, how about you? What would the one most important point you think I would need to get across to policymakers if they're considering marine aquaculture as a tool to help address climate change?
I think there's still a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of potential. And, this is the classic scientific response. We need more research. But In the case of using macroalgae as a sequestration tool, we definitely need more research as whether that is a viable option. In the case of using red macroalgae as a feed additive to reduce methane emissions in ruminants, that is very promising and definitely justifies more research. There are lots of potential inroads, and scientifically, we just need to get over a couple of additional hurdles to realize not only the potential to be a force for reducing reducing greenhouse gas emissions and climate adaptation, but really understanding the additional trade-offs, the additional costs, how they might be implemented. It's kind of the nuts and bolts and operations of what it might look like as a viable tool. We're not quite there yet. And so we need to do a little more thinking and hard analysis.
And Becca, no pressure, but last word.
Okay.
So what would your one recommendation be as a piece of advice if I were going to approach policymakers who are considering marine aquaculture as a potential tool to address climate change?
Yeah. So the main point I would make echoes a little bit what Heidi was saying as well, is that climate change is a huge challenge for our time, and our food systems are a really significant contributor to climate change, to greenhouse gas. And I think that we need to look at a lot of different solutions for how we make our food systems more sustainable, but aquaculture can be an important part of that. And we need to be thinking about the sources of our food in terms of how much emissions they have. And aquaculture does vary in its emissions, of course, but especially if we can do more emissions-friendly aquaculture, including finfish, if we can shift people from eating beef to eating fish that was grown in aquaculture, that can be a real important achievement as far as lowering the environmental impact of the food that we're producing. And so really looking at our food systems in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions, I think, is a really important thing to look at. And when we look at that, there's a lot of argument for shifting some of that towards the oceans.
Okay, so just to make sure that I'm capturing everything that you guys just said. So as Heidi mentioned, first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to understand and acknowledge that aquaculture does have some promise, but we also need to understand and acknowledge that there's still a lot of room to grow in terms of our knowledge and the body of research and understanding exactly how marine aquaculture fits into that broader climate solutions portfolio. Did I capture that correctly? All right, so Becca, Heidi, Dane, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We really learned a lot today about marine aquaculture in terms of its potential to help society adapt and build resilience in the changing climate. I want to thank our audience for tuning in, and once again, you can go to aquariumpacific.org for bios and resources from this and other panels in this series. Now go vote and go eat some seafood. Bye.